Glad you're covering this, James, albeit a little late. Sting was never quite the same without Stuart and Andy. In fact, he became quite bland later on, said Martin in Worthing. Listen, I did stress that I was not talking about the police, the band. I'm talking about the police, the institution, the force of law and order. Although, well played to whoever it was. It's disappeared down my inbox now. Well played to whoever it was that pointed out Sadiq Khan has told Cressida Dick, don't stand so close to me. I wonder what broke the camel's back. I wonder what it was that prompted Sadiq Khan to take this action. I wonder how much of it was political. I hope very, very little, if any. You never know. I think it's a very, very inconveniently timed departure from Boris Johnson's point of view. This is entirely speculative, but I think the facts support the theory. I imagine that Boris Johnson was, if you gave him the choice of leaving Cressida Dick in post as the sort of final touches are put to these investigations into the parties that were thrown at Downing Street, or having this sort of interregnum, this period of confusion or limbo, I imagine, given the decisions she has made arguably in his favour prior to now, I imagine Boris Johnson would have rather liked to have Cressida Dick in post when the final decisions were due to be made. Similarly, and this only struck me literally as I was walking down the stairs, so forgive me if it turns out to be a load of old pants, Priti Patel, blindsided reportedly by the dismissal. Cressida Dick's position became untenable after Sadiq Khan made it clear he had lost confidence in her. Home Secretary didn't know it was happening, got told over the phone that it was happening. But of course, the idea of any senior member of Boris Johnson's government playing a hand in getting rid of someone for either being rubbish or dishonest, and Cressida Dick, of course, is not accused of breaking the law, as the Prime Minister currently is, any member of that government getting fired for anything would be ridiculous, as we've covered several times in the past. You can't fire Matt Hancock for canoodling, can you, when your entire life has been one long canoodle, in the case of Prime Minister. And similarly, we now know he couldn't fire Matt Hancock for breaking lockdown rules by having a snog in his office, because he was apparently breaking lockdown rules all over the shop in his own home and workplace. So, you know, the idea of a fish rotting from their head down is quite incredible. He couldn't fire Dominic Cummings for driving to Barnard Castle and back in the middle of lockdown, because obviously he knew stuff that we didn't know at the time, and it would have been an act of epic hypocrisy, which no doubt, knowing what we now know about Dominic Cummings would have used to wreak his terrible revenge. I think it's a terrible decision from Boris Johnson's point of view, and the completely correct decision from everybody else's. I don't know why it's taken him so long. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. I don't want to invite you to speculate wildly, and I don't think there's much purpose to be served by asking whether you think it's a good idea that he has gone or a bad idea. I am really interested in leadership roles. I'm quite I was going to say silly person or naive person. I don't know. I'm quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Daft? They can't all be true, Keith. You know, I'm trying to pick one word here that is a mildly self-deprecating description of somebody who is clever enough to realise what he doesn't understand. And I used to do this thing when I was a bit younger and even sillier, where if I didn't understand something, I presumed it was because there was something wrong with the thing I didn't understand. So, you know, when we talk about consultants going into businesses and earning £1,000 a day, I still think that a lot of it is probably unnecessary or excessive. But clearly, just because you don't understand what somebody does doesn't mean that you should automatically poo-poo it. So I would once have been quite sniffy about the phrase leadership roles and leadership training and all that kind of thing. Then I think a large part of my about turn on that would be the influence of my friend John Amaechi, actually, who writes and trains in this field in a way that makes me, or has made me, understand that it is, there are some teachable skills. You know, leadership is an attribute that some people possess. And I mean effective, positive leadership, not the sort of human maypoles around which credulous and corrupt people can be persuaded to dance. your Trumps. Have you seen the story about Donald Trump being accused of trying to flush important documents down the actual toilet? It's the second funniest story about right-wing American politicians in the news today. I shall try to remember to tell you what the first funniest story about right-wing American politicians in the news today is. But your human maypoles like a Trump or increasingly, obviously and sadly, a Johnson. I mean, leadership being effective. I've been very lucky in my career to work on several occasions for people that I genuinely find or found inspiring. People who did, you sort of think of military terms at this point, don't you? They're people who you would follow into battle, as it were. People who you would, even perhaps metaphorically speaking, take a bullet for. I've been very lucky in that sense. And you know, sometimes leadership, brilliant leadership, can be a matter of not doing much, having the confidence, the wit, the wisdom to let your people do what they want to do. They give them the freedom, the very light touch. My best bosses have been the ones with the lightest touch on the tiller. My worst bosses have been the micromanagers, the ones who want to dot every I and cross every T. And I don't know what leadership is in the context of a massive police force. I just don't. I'm not going to apologise for that, because you don't either. Unless you're in a massive police force. And even then you probably don't. I do think that the straw that broke Sadiq Khan's back, and we can ask him next week, he's coming in to take your calls next Thursday. I do think that the Charing Cross report seemed to affect him in ways that previous events had not. This misogyny, discrimination, bullying and sexual harassment that was discovered within the ranks of the Met Police by the police watchdog, I think coming after the officers that were dismissed for taking photographs of well, I'll say a crime scene. I don't know, I should have asked their mum actually how she feels about having their names mentioned, Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, again and again on the radio in that context. I think she would probably want them to be remembered, to be named for the wonderful human beings, the wonderful women and the wonderful daughters that they were, rather than remembered as the victims of posthumous victims of that particularly unpleasant crime. But that seemed to me, those two stories seemed to me to coalesce, to create a sense that something very rotten at the heart of the Metropolitan Police. And I say this with great reluctance and sadness, really, because the thin blue line is what separates us from chaos and criminality. But I don't know, given that story launched in March 2018, 9 linked independent investigations concerning serving police officers from the Met, allegations that one had had sex with a vulnerable woman in a room in a police station, although that one was never proven. 14 officers investigated, 2 dismissed for gross misconduct. The rest sort of shuffled around, 2 resigned, several others faced. I mean, that was the problem that I think gives the lie to the somewhat hopeful claim that when you criticise the top brass, you're not criticising the rank and file. When you criticise the lions, when you criticise the donkeys, you're not criticising the lions that they lead. I think recent events have kind of created for me, and I know, I mean, it would be like judging all LBC presenters by the antics of 1 or 2 of them. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that just because, you know, some police officers, a significant seeming number of police officers appear to have been engaged in really gross behaviour, that this culture of banter has actually masked something far fouler. I know that a lot of people will not be part of it. I know that a lot of officers will not be part of it. But I think it would be foolish to... I think it would be foolish now to say, when I criticise Cressida Dick, I'm not criticising the ordinary officers pounding the proverbial beat. Because, I mean, very simply put, how much of the bad stuff that goes on follows poor leadership? And this is why I'm talking about leadership. How much responsibility does the head of the Met bear for bad things that happen in the Metropolitan Police? I suppose my question is twofold. I'm asking you just how much of a mess the Met is in. 0345 60 60 973. I'm not going to lay down the law. See what I did there? I'm not going to lay down the law on who I want to answer that question, but it should be obvious who is going to be more qualified to answer it, but how much of a mess is the Metropolitan Police in? 03456060973. And how much of that is down to Cressida Dick? I find the concept, the issue, the practice of leadership fascinating. I think, who was the last politician to actually invoke collective, individual ministerial responsibility? The last Secretary of State to actually resign because something had gone horribly wrong on their watch, over which they would have had very little oversight. So Amber Rudd resigned because she made a mistake, because she personally did something wrong. Was it Peter Carrington over the Falklands? Was it Lord Carrington resigning after the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands while he was Secretary of State for Defence? Or Foreign Secretary? You'll forgive me for not remembering. I was only about 9. But I think that was probably the last time. So as the world has turned and as our existence has got more complicated and as institutions have become huger, the idea of the head honcho in something like the Metropolitan Police being responsible for the individual antics of one corrupt police officer is clearly untenable in most ways. But if there's institutional corruption, if there's institutional racism, if there's institutional mess, how much of that gets traced back? How much of that trickles down from the very top? I really hope we can have an interesting conversation about this. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. I think that story about police constables based at Charing Cross Police Station was probably the tip of a hideous iceberg. It seems to me almost impossible that would have been an entirely isolated and self-contained group of officers who engaged in behaviour that the rest of the Metropolitan Police would find completely abhorrent. And of course other very recent events, somewhat support the notion that there is something really rotten running through a lot of the Metropolitan Police Service. And it would be misogyny, discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment and racism. I think. I hope not, but look at the numbers, look at the facts, look at the recent history. So how much of that can you realistically lay at the door of Cressida Dick? Here's the question, get there in the end. What is the job of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner? What is the job? And I wonder whether a little later, if the appetite is there, because I'm conscious that it's both a national story and a London story, the Metropolitan Police. I often ask myself, and indeed the producer, will they care about this in Kidderminster? But some days London stories do extend across the entire United Kingdom, the biggest and most senior police officer in the land. But if we get a picture in the next hour of something very rotten at the heart of the Met, then we may turn our attention to the question of what could be done to fix it. And then everyone has an answer, don't they? Because everyone has a relationship with the police service. What could be done to improve matters? I should tell you that there is a story developing with regard to Wayne Couzens and a police watchdog investigation into issues with which he was involved. There's a WhatsApp group, messages sent before the murder of Sarah Everard. One Kent police officer has been served with a misconduct notice in addition to the WhatsApp group. 2 current Met officers and 1 former officer are being looked at. The CPS is considering potential offences against them in relation to messages sent on a WhatsApp group before the murder of Sarah Everard. And another officer in the Kent force, not the Met, has been served with a misconduct notice relating to the handling of an investigation into indecent exposure allegations involving Couzens in 2015. So, albeit that one of those officers is in the Kent force, it does rather create the idea, it just gives the lie to attempts by well-meaning people like me to argue that just because the top brass appear to be out to lunch doesn't mean that the ordinary rank-and-file officers aren't stand-up men and women who deserve our unwavering support. John's in Islington. John, what made you pick up the phone?
What made me pick up the phone? I wanted to say that as an ex-police officer, ex-Met police officer, that the buck must stop with Cressida Dick. Everything that goes on in the Met, she ultimately is responsible for what's been going on. She's ultimately responsible for the sorry, I'm very nervous.
Oh, don't be. Think of the things you've done in your career. How can you possibly be nervous talking to me?
I am, but the culture within the Met is very much down to her. One point I wanted to make was that in order for things to change, and this is going to sound really odd, but the person that needs to be in charge of the Met has to be a white male. And the reason why I say that is because we need somebody who's willing to put their hands up and say, you know what, I've been really silly in the past. I have been like this. I have had these thoughts. I have been prejudiced in the past. But what I was very, very stupid, and I shouldn't be like that. And
it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work, John. Drawing on my professional expertise, such as it is, if stories emerged like that, even if it was a 10-year-old WhatsApp group, I don't think you would be able to stay in post by being however sincere your.
I'm being honest, because we've all done it, haven't we?
Well, no. I don't think we all have done it.
I think.
Well, it depends what you're talking about, but there's lots of people who've never been publicly racist or even privately racist.
Well, I'm not necessarily talking about racism.
No.
I'm talking about people who have, in some way, been bigoted. They've been sexist, or
I'd go with that.
It can be people that have just simply ignored somebody or just chuckled.
Or passed off as banter something which has caused enormous hurt and pain to somebody else, which you've can't. Yeah, no, I've actually written a book about this, so I don't know why I'm disagreeing with you.
We've all done that. We've all done it.
To varying degrees. I don't want to get distracted or confused. To varying degrees, we have all indulged in prejudicial or bigoted behaviour, but I don't quite know what you're.
Just as much.
Yeah, but the top of the Met. Hang on, the guy. So what? I mean, you need someone who would come out and say, "I used to be in one of these WhatsApp groups." Do you see what I mean? That wouldn't wash.
I'm saying that we need somebody who's willing to say, I used to be like that, and it was now see that it was completely wrong. It was completely wrong being like that, and we are going to chat. I'm willing, as a person at the top of the Met, to say, this is completely wrong. I was like that. We're not going to be like that anymore.
I don't think they'd be allowed the space to do that. I think I'd join you in wishing that they would and could, but I just don't think that they would be allowed the space to do that. Can I ask you briefly about the threshold between individual and institution? So we can't claim Cressida Dick is responsible for that officer there doing something gross, whether it is the ultimate crime in the case of Wayne Couzens, or whether it's something despicable in the case of photographing two dead women, or whether it is just horrible in the case of the Charing Cross officers swapping WhatsApp groups. So at what point does it become a big enough issue for it to be the chief's responsibility? Do you see what I mean? If I punch Keith after the show today, I don't think that the head of Global Radio is going to have to resign. But if everybody in the building is punching each other on a regular basis, then clearly that is something that would be traceable to the very top of the institution. Well, I don't know where the line is. You may not either, but I wonder where you draw it.
I think that the culture has to be set by the person at the top, and it has to permeate. The person at the top, Cressida Dick, should have said to her officers below her, the senior management, look, this is what I expect. If people below you are behaving in such a way, you can expect that your jobs are going to go as well. And I can guarantee you, as soon as she said that, but things would have changed. Things ought to have changed, but she didn't. She wasn't able to do that.
And finally, how much do you think of the problem is attributable to the fact that she clung on to her job, jobs plural, because she was Gold Commander on the John Charles de Menezes shooting? Yeah. How much moral authority does she lose by staying in post after presiding over events that many people found, although no laws were broken, many people found them pretty repellent? Does that send out a message in a way that Boris Johnson has a cabinet full of people who have become unsackable because he can't sack anyone, because whatever it is he sacks them for, he's almost certainly done it himself 100 times. Her clinging on to her job after this catalogue of catastrophic events, does that undermine the whole force? Does that create an air of impunity among officers?
Perhaps so. Yeah. Perhaps. I think it is. I think it's such a tricky to think.
Of course it is. I hadn't thought of that until you started talking. But it makes sense, doesn't it, the more you think about it? John, thank you. You'll allow me a wry chuckle at the idea of police veteran, being nervous talking to me on the radio, but I can assure you that in almost any other circumstance it would definitely have been the other way round. 27 minutes after 10 is the time. Darren is in Sheffield. Darren, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think listening to what you were saying this morning, I was really quite angry about... I think she had to go. I don't think there was an option in the end at all. I think there were a number of issues, but I also feel so sorry the fact that she's had the integrity to do the right thing, whether people liked her leadership style or not.
Yeah.
And yet you've got Boris Johnson, who's been responsible for so many years for woefully underfunding the national policing service and not just the Met. But and he can just walk away from everything. And likewise with Sadiq Khan. I mean, I've been a bit of a supporter of Sadiq Khan in the past, but I also think his current track record on crime issues within London is not good and doesn't make for good reading. And yet both seem to be able to walk away and they have no or very little sort of spotlight put on them for what they're doing. And yet she's having to pay a massive price for areas such as, James, I think, like vetting, for example, is a massive issue within policing at the moment. And some of the problems that have come from within with individuals that, have been plastered all over the media around their failings in policing.
Yes.
A lot of that comes because the vetting areas within policing are so poorly run, there's insufficient numbers, they're not funded correctly, and things are missing. So previously in the past, some of these individuals would have never got through the door, and rightly so.
Why not? What would have been the red flag? What would have happened?
There would have been proper checks on their homes, their families. There would have been checks around their social media presence. Lots of these types of things, and they would have flagged up individuals that are absolutely not suitable for policing.
Cousins in particular looks like somebody who should have set off all sorts of alarm bells at various stages in his moves through the ranks. So many areas of vetting alone are years behind, and some forces, they'll never come on your show and admit to it, but some forces are just not even doing the basic vetting because there is such an urgent need to get officers through. And when you hear about the Boris and his 20,000 extra officers and that, it's all a false narrative because it's designed to assuage the readers of tabloid newspapers a lot of the time, isn't it? Or to accrue votes regardless of the facts. I mean, we're living in a country, Darren, where, a cabinet minister and a prime minister can claim that crime has gone down when it's actually gone up because they've decided not to count certain types of crime. I keep coming back to that because, yet again, I think it's one of the milestones on our national decline. That's incredible. And how can we have a meaningful conversation about policing with politicians who massage crime? Massage? They're not even massaging them. They're smacking them around the face with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and when you talk about massive increases in fraud crimes, for example, and it's just dismissed as a household issue by certain ministers.
People don't care about it. But then you also
get that. Yeah, exactly. And then you get those higher levels. But then you've also got somebody on who's basically utilising fraudulent use of figures. It's incredible. And,
it is, isn't
I think we're in a bit of we really are in a mess. And I think a lot of people, aside from the mistakes that Cressida Dick made, and I'm sure she did, but I've a lot of friends in the Met. I've not long retired, and I've got retired friends that have only just finished in the Met. There is also a huge issue with officer morale, James. Officers are going to work every day nervous and frightened because the level of assaults on officers on a daily basis is horrific. So trying to go to work with a positive mindset and a mindset that will impact and make life better for Londoners is very, very difficult when you're nervous and you're not supported and you haven't got numbers. This is far bigger than just her leadership. I think she was popular within a lot of the officers when she got the role.
Yes.
And I think there were good parts of it. But yes, she's lost sight within of numerous internal stuff which needs to be got at, and there needs to be a real root and branch review of how things are done. But there needs to be a lot of people and police officers ignore the damage that's being done by Boris Johnson and the Tories since they come in.
Well, yeah, I remember. So I'm
policing.
going to have to interrupt. I can tell because I mean you're dropping truth bombs all over the place. But I'm already late for the news, and I am reminded just at the end there, as you mentioned, 12 years of Tory rule of Theresa May standing up and accusing officers who said if you reduce our numbers, you reduce our effectiveness, and she accused them, of course, of scaremongering. Darren, thank you, mate. How much? I mean, it can't all be her fault, can it? And I'll remind you of a phrase in the IOPC, the Independent Office for Police Conduct's report into that toxic atmosphere at Charing Cross Police Station. We believe these incidents are not isolated or simply the behaviour of a few bad apples. I haven't asked him. I'll ask him next week when he's in the studio. But my feeling is that this was the straw that broke Sadiq Khan's confidence, finally, in Cressida Dick. Many would argue belatedly. I'm probably one of them. But I would also remind you that better late than never is a well-worn adage for good reason. It's not isolated or simply the behaviour of a few bad apples. So how much of institutional decline can be attributed to the individual person at the top? There is no objective answer to this question. There's no right answer to this question. Our first two callers, both recently retired from the Met, provided quite different analyses of the situation, and I found them equally compelling and fascinating. So this isn't one of those phone-ins where there's going to be a winner. I just want to know what you, drawing upon your understandings and experiences, think about the simple question of how much of institutional, I just use the word corruption in its loosest sense, institutional corruption, as in rottenness, how much institutional corruption can be attributable to the individual at the top. And remember, they haven't been at the top forever, so it can't all be on them. So what is that relationship? What does it look like? And I've got some phone lines free now for the first time since 10 o'clock. If you want to grab one of them, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Martha is in Newton Abbot in Devon. Martha, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi.
Hello,
yes,
Martha.
thanks for taking the call.
You're very welcome.
And there are 2 points, one of which I think you've really explored widely, which is the parallels with leadership and, Boris Johnson.
Yes.
And I think you have explored that really clearly, the lack of responsibility there. But the other thing I wanted to say was it is enormously difficult to actually manage culture in a huge organisation with something like 43,000 staff. I mean, I led a culture change project with the Met, actually, a number of years ago under Sir Ian Blair. It was a fairly wide-ranging project, actually.
Can I ask what your qualifications are? It's not mystery hour, but I'd love to know what your sort of role
Well,
was.
I'm a diversity and leadership consultant.
Okay.
I was a diversity and leadership consultant, yeah. So I've carried out a lot of work around culture change in a number of organisations, including the Met. And we designed an approach where we actually identified what they thought the issues actually were initially, how they felt where they felt they were achieving, where they felt they were failing. And in those areas where they felt that they were failing, we actually worked with groups of staff to find out how they felt it could be remedied. So rather than it being a top-down approach, sorry, using the jargon, it actually came from the staff itself.
Okay,
and in fact,
that's interesting.
In the limited number that we carried out, because it had to be focused at borough level, so we were only able to work with 5 boroughs, it was successful. And what we found, in fact, was leadership at the top was generally very good. I mean, we had general leadership training. Where there were potential difficulties was at the level of middle management, what they call the permafrost, sergeants, inspectors, because they were the ones that had the day-to-day management of their staff. And that was where, if there were any problems, they were highlighted and they came to the fore. So, but we just, as I said, we just managed to work in 5 boroughs.
So if I went into a police station, if you went into a police station and asked the constables what they were upset or unhappy about, and then you identified it, and then you said, where does that come from? They're not going to say it comes from the Commissioner's office. They're going to say it comes from Sergeant Bloggs over there, aren't they?
Well, no, because it was anonymous, so it came out with... A lot of them would actually, would focus on their area.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, a lot of them would focus on that. But no, to be honest, a lot of them put the blame usually at the top of senior management.
Okay.
In most surveys.
Wrongly, in your view?
I'm sorry?
Wrongly, in your view? Have I misunderstood you? I thought...
Not completely.
Okay.
Not completely.
Okay. Yes.
But, obviously there is the pop, but certainly... from my experience, from the leadership training I was involved in, people at the top were generally very good. They had it, but
can I make a cheeky suggestion? Would you mind?
No.
How do you know the difference between someone who's very good at leadership training and very good at being a police officer, very good at achieving high scores on a leadership training seminar, is not necessarily someone who's very good at being a senior police officer? Or am I being unfair to your expertise?
I think that's a valid point, actually. But normally, we would get feedback from their staff as well. It wasn't just their view or our view as to how they were coming across. It would also be views of the staff and how they saw these people, how they viewed them.
Yes.
So usually it was a sort of 360 approach. It was a very intensive project, very costly. I think it was costly for the Met. They put the resources in. They found that it had made a difference. It had made a difference. A lot of issues came to the fore that were tackled at the time. And because it was tackled by the staff, rather than, as I say, imposed on them.
I understand that.
It did seem to have an impact. But the point I suppose I wanted to make, and the real point, was that it is really, really difficult. Somebody in Cressida Dick's position, she doesn't have the resources now, I would imagine, for leadership training, for management training, for all that sort of stuff that seemed to disappear about diversity awareness, all that. I think a lot of that has gone out of the window.
Yeah.
And I think
not only has it gone out of the window, but
managing in that situation, it was very hard.
Yeah, and if the new person came in and announced that they were going to be spending X £100,000 or millions of pounds on diversity and leadership training that is clearly sorely needed, then all of the right-wing tabloids that today are celebrating Cressida Dick's defenestration, they'd be up in arms about this woke police culture. I can't believe it. They're training police officers on how not to be racist. I don't need any training on how not to be racist. And can I have a column in The Sun to talk about why anybody's suggesting that you can, what's the phrase, unconscious bias? How dare they accuse me of unconscious bias? And that's precisely what needs to be done to the Metropolitan Police. And all the people who today are crowing about Cressida Dick's defenestration, give it a week and they'd be throwing their toys out of the pram and spitting their dummies about the idea of any money being spent on actually training people out of the cultures, the behaviours and the mindsets that are responsible for a lot of the horrors that we've been hearing about and reporting. So it's not a defence of Cressida Dick, far from it, but it's just an endorsement of Martha's very evidence-based analysis of a system that needs proper investment and clever training, clever directed, targeted training. You could almost write the Richard Littlejohn column yourself, couldn't you, on this sort of thing? You'd quote D.I. Gene Hunt out of Life on Mars, say something stupid about the Sweeney, and then start whining about why police officers can't solve crimes anymore because they're too busy being given exactly the sort of lessons they need to ensure that they don't end up sending gross messages to Wayne Couzens. It is unbelievable. Well, except it's not, is it? It's all too believable. Phone lines are open, 0345 60 60973 is the number you need. You've got this group at Charing Cross sending racist, misogynistic, bullying, sexual harassment, discrimination. How do you fix that? You either sack them all immediately or you sit them down, give them a long, hard, clever talking to, and some of them will begin to see the light. Some of them will move towards the light. But that's called diversity training, and we've created a culture of so-called anti-woke politics and media now, where precisely the sort of thing that these people and all of us by association desperately need has been successfully maligned and discredited by the usual idiots. Gosh, that's the end of my TED Talk. We examined the departure of Cressida Dick, many would say long overdue departure of Cressida Dick from the most senior police office in the land, and wonder what it says about the broader issues facing the police service across the country, but particularly, of course, in the case of the Metropolitan Police. And I say across the country, quite a few of you are texting and tweeting me messages, reports of similar issues unfolding elsewhere. A racist and sexist Hampshire Police Unit officers dismissed. That was reported on the 8th of January last year. But it gives the idea. That's what the word institutional means. And of course, the two words that come into play here, you'll remember that the government commissioned a report that miraculously came back with the finding that there was no such thing really as institutional racism. But hey-ho. The other word, of course, is unconscious, and it's unconscious bias. Sometimes people don't know that what they're doing is wrong. And obviously, the wrong things they do are lionised and lauded in most of the cheaper prints, the sort of right-wing tabloid media. So, you know, that's where the anti-woke movement comes from. Right, we're gonna do a little bit of training on why you shouldn't be sending WhatsApp messages about wanting to rape your colleagues. So there are two responses to that. Either, crikey, people sending WhatsApp messages about wanting to rape their colleagues really do need a proper talking to, or I don't need any training at all. I mean, how can anybody be anti-woke when it simply involves teaching people, training people, instructing people in how to behave in ways that will never involve misogyny, discrimination, bullying and sexual harassment in an actual flipping police station? But hey-ho, we've made our bed. 10:51 is the time. Michael is in Brentwood. Michael, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
Long-time listener, big fan. Thank you for doing what you do. I'm very nervous, first-time caller. So apologies if this comes across as kind of weird and fractured and stuff.
Don't worry about it.
The police inspire, they kind of invoke a lot of passion, anger from me. I come from a fringe demographic. I'm, born and raised traveller until I was like 16, 17, something like that. Moved out, got a house, settled down, so on and so forth. I'm now a normal person, quote unquote. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone from any kind of. I use the term fringe, but
yes.
that's not. It's not really the right word.
What is the right word? Let's get it right. Okay, is it?
I mean, so
minority almost is the word we're looking for.
Yeah, that's a far better word. Sorry, apologies. Okay.
Well, don't apologise to me, Michael. I'll tell you when you need to apologise.
So I think you'd be hard pressed to find any people from minority communities that didn't already know the Met Police, or in fact. Why narrow it? Why say the Met Police?
Yes,
Just
the
generally
police.
The institution of the police. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone from a minority community who would say that the police isn't institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic, any of these things.
Yes.
I grew up in and around East and South East London.
Right.
Lower class, as I say, traveller.
Yes.
Some of the stuff that I've seen the police firsthand get away with is shocking. It's like people, the right-wing press will always trot out stories about, traveller communities getting in fights and young black kids running around the streets and stabbing each other up and so on and so forth. I tend to kind of only half read that nonsense because it is the aforementioned nonsense.
Well, it's not. It's nonsense in a sense of it gets far too much or far more attention than similar crimes.
Correct,
I mean, we've literally got a government now that says don't count fraud as a crime. So, but these things do happen. I mean, knife crime on the streets of London is a terrible and major issue. But I understand what you mean. The relationship between reality and reporting is somewhat strained in these issues.
But in that capacity, as much as the stories of minorities are brought forward, minority communities brought forward into the press, nothing is ever kind of shone. And the police are never held to the same standard. The institution of the police is never held to the same standard. And in my opinion, as a baseline, I'll be honest, I have a hatred for the police as an institution, owing to the things that I've witnessed.
What's the worst thing you've witnessed?
Personally, I was staying with my father on a site in southeast London.
Yes.
Police were evicting the community because it was a squatted site, so it had come up for eviction. all of the police removed their kind of identifiers, their tags, badges, whatever. A few of them grabbed a couple of my mates and just leathered them behind, leathered them out there in the street, 14, 15-year-old kids kicking 7 shades out of them.
And that's a lifetime of animosity starting right there, isn't it?
But it starts younger than that. Like, I think, forgive me on the year of this, but the Battle of the Beanfield, I think, was like around 89, 90, something like that.
Yeah.
Forgive me on that. The same thing down in down in wherever it was, Devon.
So what is it? What do we describe it? There is a sort of sense of, there's snobbery involved here. There's discrimination. There's a pleasure that is taken in the exercise of power in a corrupt fashion, that's systemic.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Right.
Now, with Cressida Dick. Okay. Now.
Yeah. Well, how much do you blame her for what is the current state of play, for the current ugliness?
So in my age, I'm 37 this year, I think. Yeah, 37.
Yep.
With age, I've come to kind of look at the world, analyse things, and I've learned to play the game of don't blame the individual, but rather blame the circumstance, the environment. Okay?
Blame the game. Don't blame the player, blame the game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Cressida Dick, right? I can appreciate from an individual's position how, if given the opportunity to affect a real and meaningful change within any institution, and with enough naivety, I can appreciate that a person could believe that they could do that.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of, despite my better instincts,
yes,
I kind of want to feel sympathetic toward the leadership of any police, because they are taking on the role of trying to affect the kind of benefit, what I can only suppose to be, trying to affect the kind of beneficial changes.
Okay, you give them, we'd need more evidence, wouldn't we? We'd need to see more evidence that she had tried to do these things. And Sadiq Khan has clearly concluded that she hasn't tried hard enough. I suspect the writing was on the wall for her when she started describing herself in glowing terms and claiming that she'd done a bang-up job and she'd worked very hard and made great progress in all of these areas. I don't know, but I will, as I keep saying, I'll ask him next week. But I hear you. It's a bit easy. It's a bit lazy to say, it's all on her, when clearly a lot of the stuff that goes on was inherited, and a lot of the stuff that goes on was something that she would have come down on like a ton of bricks if she'd known about it. But that's kind of what this amorphous issue of leadership addresses. Michael, thank you. 10:57 is the time. Jack's in Rayleigh. You're not on Otter, are you, Jack, by any chance?
Good morning.
Good morning. What do you want to say? Right? Yeah, very well. What's on your mind?
Well, I've found this debate regarding Cressida Dick and the Metropolitan Police quite interesting.
I might not put that in an advert. Quite interesting. Jack in Rayleigh. Carry on.
I think in my view, the main issues that come out of this continually is the recruitment of police officers and the training process that takes place once they've been recruited. Now, in years gone by, and I assume it's still the case, every officer that joined the police force was put on 2-year probation. Now, in that 2-year probation, if an officer was considered unsuitable to continue in the service, then he could be dismissed without any question or argument.
But we still ended up with the officers responsible for the Stephen Lawrence debacle and an entire police force described by Macpherson as institutionally racist, didn't we? Even with the 2-year probation period.
We did, but this James, is the point that I'm trying to make, is that there needs to be more emphasis and importance placed on the recruitment process to try and root out individuals at the beginning and not after it's too late, after they're maybe midway through their service and have been really bad apples that haven't come to light until something serious of the nature that we've been talking about today comes to light.
It's a double-edged sword, though, Jack, because they're struggling to get the numbers anyway, and they're struggling to tempt people into the service. You'll know that wages are lower. It's a much less attractive job. The lower morale goes, the less attractive the job becomes, and the worse the caliber of candidate that's coming. It's like a vicious circle, isn't it, in a way?
No. Yeah, I can understand that, James, but it's still it doesn't still change my view that there's something badly wrong here. Now, I don't want to sound like one of these people in my day type of thing, but in years gone by...
But in my day.
Yeah, that's right. In years gone by. I mean, I was a police officer myself for 30 years, and I retired in 1995.
Right.
So you're talking about from 1965 to 1995,
Gosh.
and all these technical social media sites, etc., were hardly off the ground at that time when I retired. It was a different world, but the same situation should apply today that applied when...
a much higher bar to get into the Met. But the problem is that there aren't enough people running at the low bar. So how are you going to get a better calibre of candidate with a higher bar is a massive challenge. Jack's bang on, isn't he? A massive challenge for whoever turns out to be the next Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And I wonder, I'm finding this absolutely riveting, or as Jack said, quite interesting. I wonder also whether or not we can have a conversation about that, or whether it is a bit too close to the bone. Is there a major problem with the sort of candidate that is currently being attracted to and accepted into the police force? I think Priti Patel has criticised Sadiq Khan, called him rude or something for not telling her or not consulting with her before essentially getting rid of Cressida Dick as head of the Met. And it occurred to me, as we talked about cultures and leadership, rude and unprofessional, Priti Patel has called him. That's the same Priti Patel who was found in an independent inquiry to have bullied her staff. And you can't make this stuff up anymore, can you? Rude and unprofessional, says not convicted because it wasn't a criminal offence, proven bully. And that, of course, was the independent inquiry that the advisor on ministerial standards felt compelled to resign over when Boris Johnson elected to ignore it. So how can Priti Patel sack anyone? How could she call anyone rude and unprofessional? They literally did a full inquiry into whether or not she'd bullied staff. It came back and said, hell yes! There you go, Mr. Johnson. Here's the evidence that your Home Secretary is a bully. Oh, it was past the shredder, will you, Dominic? Past the shredder. Carrie. Past the shredder, Carrie. And it goes straight in the shredder. And then so this is what I mean about a culture. This is what I mean by institutional. Why couldn't the Home Secretary get rid of Cressida Dick? Well, because you have a Prime Minister who can't sack anybody ever, because whatever it is he's sacking them for is almost certainly something he's done himself tenfold. Whether it's personal morality or whether it is public venality. You know, some people are still claiming he hasn't been proven that he's a liar. He said there weren't any parties. And then he said he hadn't been to any parties. And now he's hired a lawyer in the Times today in order to hopefully argue that he deserves a unique dispensation because his workplace was also his home. Conveniently overlooking the fact that millions upon millions of us, even me, I'm a radio presenter, our workplace was also our home for months during the coronavirus crisis, and none of us threw parties. It's going to be some lawyer, isn't it, that? Yeah, you've got to let him off because his workplace was also his home. But you weren't allowed to have parties in your workplace or your home. Yeah. Okay. That's why they pay me the big bucks. I can't wait to see what that legal advice looks like. And the other bit of the Times very good today. Stephen Swinford, their political editor, has clearly got some impeccable sources in the heart of Downing Street, as you would hope. And the other story is the one that sounds very much like a threat. Scotland Yard needs to be, quote, very certain that the Prime Minister has breached lockdown rules before issuing him with a fixed penalty notice. A senior ally of the Prime Minister has, it's the verb deployed by the journalist, has warned. So Downing Street, and when it says a source, a senior ally of the Prime Minister, that's shorthand for saying it's come straight from the horse's mouth. That is the Prime Minister menacing the Metropolitan Police. No wonder Liz Truss had such a nightmare yesterday. Not that long ago, a British politician, for good or for ill, and I'm perfectly aware of a long history a checkered history of British interventions and presences at home and abroad, but not that long ago, a British Foreign Secretary could have stood alongside a crook like Sergei Lavrov with a modicum of moral superiority. You could have sent British politicians to Moscow to talk to these gangsters in the Kremlin with at least some sort of moral high ground. Do you think we can do that now? Do you think we can do that now? And of course, the great champion of this brand of politics, Donald Trump, reported today to have been flushing documents down the toilet in the White House bathroom. He jammed his White House lavatory with papers that he flushed away despite an order to retain presidential records, according to a new book by Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. Staff periodically found wads of documents clogging the pipes of the lavatory used by the president. Quite incredible. But only the second scariest story involving right-wing American politicians to be reported in the news today. The other one, well, it's not scary, it's actually hilarious. And it involves Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's sort of an American Nadine Dorries, if you want to get a sort of handle on what makes her tick and where she's coming from, and even perhaps her acuity. Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about the Nazi secret police. Now, it begins with G. The secret police that operated under the Nazis. Can you remember what they were called? Yeah? I mean, you only have to watch Hello, Hello. You don't even need to read a book. The Gestapo. Or was it Herr Flick? Was Herr Flick from the Gestapo in Hello, Hello? I think it was. Guess what Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks they were called? You're not going to believe me, actually. You're going to think I've made this up, but I haven't. I wonder if there's audio. Can we see if there's a clip of it anywhere? So Marjorie Taylor Greene, a sort of Republican right-wing firebrand, thinks that the Nazis' secret police were not the Gestapo, but the Gazpacho, which is as my listeners will know, a rather delicious and refreshing cold Spanish soup. The Gazpacho, quick, stash the radio, Tommy, the Gazpacho are coming. And that's the kind of people that are now achieving positions of power in the regimes of, or did, the American Republican Party and I guess to a lesser extent the British Conservative Party. Jane's in Croydon. Anyway, Jane, sorry to keep you. What would you like to say?
Hi, Jane.
Hello, Jane.
Hi, James.
I'll be James, you be Jane.
I just wanted to give you a bit of insight into my own experience. So I used to work for the Met, and I often hear people speak about the racism. But I think what I was most shocked about was the misogyny. I found that worse than the racism. Just to give you some background, I joined, I think, like 2003, not long after the Macpherson report had published and deemed the Met Police to be institutionally racist. And there was, I guess, a positive drive to hire more people from ethnic minorities. I'm black, so that's the reason why I'm bringing it up. And when I joined, I mean, generally the team was quite a nice team, but there was such a clear unconscious bias, whether it was the attitudes to women, the attitudes to the community they served. And it immediately was apparent to me that a lot of that wasn't, it wasn't malicious. A lot of it was because a lot of the Met aren't actually from London. You'll have somebody, for an example, from the Scottish Highlands who's come from a very small community of people that very much like them, speak like them, and their first experience as an 18-year-old of inner city or London is when they come to work for the Met. And I don't know whether you can appreciate just the lack of understanding of the cultures, of what London is about. And, some of the talk in the office was often things like, I mean, the first time I ever heard the term race card was actually working in the police, and they were referring to, I think, an Asian officer who had applied for a job and hadn't got it, and they said, oh, no, he's probably going to put the race card out there again. And, when your ears pring up, you think, oh, my God, it is true. They really do say that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's, wow. The first time, I'm pausing because I'm reeling a bit and thinking, but I'm also reflecting upon the kind of two-way traffic, because the race card is a phrase that appears all the time in right-wing media as well. So it's as if these police officers are the Daily Mail made flesh.
But I think what people forget and fail to realise is that the police are us and we are the police.
Yes, of course.
And in the same way that we have awful people in society, there's awful people in the police, and there's great people in the police. I have some wonderful friends, many wonderful friends, and many great police officers. And I think, one of them actually is Cressida. She actually was one of the good people. Really, really was one of the good people. I don't actually have the answers to how you can improve the culture.
But do you have an answer to how widespread the rottenness is? Because in a way, silence is violence, they say, isn't it? Complicity is silence is complicity. If you're not calling it out, you're part of the problem. And if you're not calling it out, then that's almost the entire Met, according to some readings.
So the unconscious bias,
Yes.
I think we use it as a broad brush, and I think that there are various extremes of it. I don't think I saw the absolute extremes.
No.
I just saw, I guess, people who I would say I don't want to even call them ignorant, isn't really fair, but they just didn't understand. They
Had
didn't
no
understand
idea how offensive they were. Yeah,
and
I
as
get
a
a lot of that.
consequence, yeah,
I've worked
because
with
I
people
found,
like that.
but I'm
Still
being
do.
biased here, but I found that the officers that were born in London
Yeah.
were better officers generally.
Yeah,
when
that's
I
really
worked
interesting.
in terms of how widespread, I guess you hear of the worst examples, so the Charing Cross being particularly disgusting. I never saw anything like that, although I've seen some quite questionable behaviour, things shared, like, text messages or, things that, are definitely inappropriate shared, but nothing to the extent of things that have been published. But then again, like I said, the police are us and we are the police, and people do this in normal life, that it's disgusting, that we think is reprehensible. And people may say, well, they're the police and they should be held to a higher standard. But how do you really identify these characters when you're vetting? What kind of analysis
I don't
do you do
know,
of the
you see.
people?
That's a really good question. I don't know what you would do. What would you do if I put you in charge? And then I'd like you to answer on a bit short of time. And then I'd like to tell me... Yeah.
How do you find a Wayne Couzens? I firmly believe that a Wayne Couzens would do that. He would find an opportunity to do that. He obviously used his position to do those terrible things. But how would you find him? How would you stop somebody from doing that? They're absolutely determined to do such a disgusting thing. And I don't know how you can hold... I mean, I know that there were other things I think he'd done. He'd been caught for, what do you call it? I can't remember what it's called now.
Being accused of exposing himself.
Yeah. And there are things to be answered
There's
around
a developing
that.
story about a WhatsApp group that he was in with other officers now being investigated as well. Why did you only last 4 years? I think you've kind of answered the question.
Why did I only last 4 years? So there were some things, obviously, like I worked in what they call a priority crime borough, so that's like robbery, burglary, guns and firearms, and I worked in a sort of predominantly sort of black area, and I guess I will never stop being affected by heinous crimes, and I just found that they just didn't care enough.
Okay.
Like
wow.
there was a lot of crime that happened in the borough that I worked in, and that's part of obviously the excitement of working for the Met.
Yes, of course.
But they are still human beings, and I never wanted to stop caring.
Yeah, I hear you.
And that's the reason. But there are some great people, a lot of great officers, and I feel that the right-wing media don't really truly reflect the good work that's done. And
then if they start trying to address the unconscious bias, they'll get a kicking for that as well, because it's woke police. Why are they doing this stuff? Why are they reaching out to the LGBTQ community? Why are they dancing at the Notting Hill Carnival or whatever it might be? So flipping depressing, isn't it? It really is.
So I did. I mean, it was broadly, I got many great things from working there, and I still have many good relationships, and I'm always quite conflicted because I'm very aware. It's like having family and being aware of the good and the bad in them, and being reluctant to speak out about them. But I don't often praise them outwardly. But when it comes to Cressida, I do speak up and say, actually, she was one of the good ones.
I'm glad you were listening today, because I think it's important. No one's all bad, are they? And she was more than that. She was obviously one of the people who did want to make meaningful change to the service that you found impossible to stay in. Whether she has or not, of course, is a question that Sadiq Khan has probably answered no to, or at least not enough meaningful change. 11:17 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And that question of the kind of people drawn into the force. I don't mean new recruits, obviously. I mean the kind of people who are in the Met, the kind of people who've been joining it during this period of decline. Is it now populated by people who are a little bit more prone to a power trip, perhaps? Big theme emerging about the importance of recruiting from within London. And I get that, actually. I wonder whether any people have got a problem with that suggestion. The number you need, as ever, 03456060973. Thank you, Jane. Amazing calls again today. This is one of those days where I am immensely gratified by the quality of the call. I mean, I'm always immensely gratified by the quality of the calls coming in, but there's a weird tension. Do you like it when I do the Toto the dog stuff? When I take the curtain back and you see the daft old duffer pushing buttons furiously and turning wheels. I mean me, not Keith, obviously. He's a little younger than me. But that give you the mechanics of how it works. I suppose, given that this is the biggest show on LBC and therefore, I mean, arguably the biggest phone-in show in the country that doesn't play the latest platters from the hit parade, I guess I'm entitled to share a little of my secrets. And I always have a tension between the quality of the calls and the decision to call time on a conversation. And very rarely do you have a sense that you could continue for hours taking calls from people who are brilliantly articulate and qualified to comment. But today, we haven't had, unlike the Metropolitan Police, we haven't had a single bad apple. Long may it continue, but obviously probably not all the way through to 1 o'clock. I'll take a view at the next news bulletin at 11:30. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. You can't apply to the Met, I'm being told now, unless you've lived in London for at least 3 years. So that obviously wasn't the case when Jane was in the force, but that would arguably be progress. But, of course, given the backdrop of the conversations that we're having, it wouldn't appear to have made much difference. Heather is in Cromer, in a lovely part of the world. Heather, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, Heather.
I've been listening to bits of your programme in between getting in and out of the car doing shopping. So not good enough. Buy some headphones. Not good enough. But what I did hear, I thought, I've got to phone in. I'm retired now from the Metropolitan Police.
Yes.
I worked there for 25 years before retiring, and as well as being a uniformed officer, I also specialised in diversity.
Okay.
As a trainer, and also in, I don't know if it still exists in the Met, but it was the Diversity and Citizen Focus Directorate.
Right.
Some of the things I don't know, it's one of those things, as soon as you leave the Met, you might as well not try and talk as though you know what you're talking about, because things change so quickly.
Yes.
But my understanding is that now people have to have a degree in policing and then join, and then divisional officers who have some training in teaching take them through their paces. Years and years ago, I was a trainer in appeals.
You don't need a degree in policing. Surely you don't have to do 3 years studying policing at university to be a police officer.
Well, I don't know. As I say, I'm out of touch. That's just my understanding.
Okay.
Is that
I don't think that doesn't ring any bells with me, but I'm often wrong, so we'll leave that. We'll park that and move on.
Are you there? I can't hear you.
No, I'm here, loud and clear.
Right, sorry,
yes. Sorry, I should have waved.
It's just that when I was a trainer at the Peel Centre,
yes,
it was a 5-month residential course, and God, we checked the hell out of the recruits. They got everything they did was reported on. We would do practical exercises, and they'd have that fed back to them. They'd have weekly reports, monthly reports.
I've read about this. Was this Hendon? Would that be Hendon?
It was a way of weeding out people who were unsuitable.
Yeah, and including how they interact with each other, the kind of things they say when they don't think they're being observed, all the sort of what you might call cultural approaches.
And it was themed through everything. So you might do a practical exercise for them to do on theft.
Yes.
But it might be with a traveller.
Right. Like Michael earlier.
As a victim.
Yes.
So it would encourage them to investigate and see how they reacted. And if we were lucky, we'd actually be able to get people in from the community to come and role play for us.
Gosh.
I doubt that's
going on now. And if it was, can you imagine how it'd be written up in the Sun? Especially if the people coming in to do the role play got given 20 quid. Got given 20 quid for doing it. The woke police paying travellers to come in and pretend to be criminals. I mean, all of these problems often lead to the same source. Would you? I mean, and I really admire I don't think many men would say I've been out of it for so long that I probably don't know what it's like anymore. I think that's men would be. I know absolutely. I'm speaking for myself. I know absolutely everything about this issue because I briefly encountered it 38 years ago. But I am intrigued by the idea of things having actually got worse, because I keep reaching for when the earlier caller did the good old days line and actually made me think, well, hang on a minute, McPherson, institutional racism, all of the stories that we're aware of. But actually, if the vetting was better then than it is now, things may be worse now. It's just that, the world turns and these stories now erupt.
And it's also, as I say, I feel sorry for Cressida Dick because
yes.
People blame her for what's going on at the moment, and I know she's the figurehead to blame, but
sure.
She's also inherited what they started before she even got the job. In about 2008, I noticed that the money was drying up. So first of all, you noticed HR gets a huge overhaul and people get made redundant, but it's okay because they're not police officers, they're civil staff. That's the attitude.
Yes.
And then that was a shame. And then, of course, they moved on to training is the next thing. Training is always undervalued, particularly in police circles where it's that sort of those who can do, those who can't teach.
Yes.
They don't.
I don't need teaching. It's instincts. Copper's instincts.
Absolutely hated.
Yes, I can believe that.
Diversity training.
And there it is again. And that is why you end up with these so-called banter-based scandals emerging on a regular basis. Heather, I bigged you up, actually. I put the pressure on you by talking about the calibre of the calls just before you came on. I don't know whether you heard that bit. You might be getting the shopping out of the boot. But you certainly lived up to the billing. You kept the bar very, very high. And it keeps coming back to this. And listen, I know I can be a stuck record sometimes. But the idea that you're going to be able to improve the attitude of these people who clearly need diversity training and unconscious bias training and cultural training about other cultures in a country where the government and the media have conspired to create an environment where that is derided and ridiculed daily as being somehow, quotes, woke, end quotes. God, why is the police so full of racists and sexists? Answer, you keep clamping down on anybody who points out racism and sexism and calling them silly names. And you're the most powerful people in the country, right up to and including Downing Street. It's coming up to 28 minutes after 11, squeezing at least one more. Steve is in Westminster. Steve, what can you tell us?
Morning, James.
Hello, Steve.
Yeah, I used to work in the Met, and I didn't leave that long ago, to be fair. But I was lucky in the fact that I came through Hendon and did my 18 weeks there. I'm not a Londoner, as you can probably guess.
Sure.
Sort of by birth. And I sort of left because I wasn't happy with how things were changing, because things in the Met change so fast.
Yeah, you're the second one to point that out. Heather said that as well.
And I think that was the problem. Your last caller was absolutely bang on right. I did 18 weeks and they would weed out people, and they did weed out people. I'm not saying the system was perfect. Now, I was lucky that halfway through my service I actually worked for professional standards as well.
Oh, blimey.
And I
what are they called, the rubber healers or something like that?
Well, yeah. Oh, yes. And I was one of those. And I'm sure there may be one or two people recognise my voice. But, realistically, we did weed out the bad apples. But, getting the bad apples was the hardest thing.
Yeah, yeah.
98% of the police do a cracking job in.
You reckon, really?
Really?
It's hard for people to believe that at the moment, given
But you know what? I think if you put your hat on,
Yeah.
and go out on the street in your uniform, and you turn up at things you have no idea what you're turning up about, and we're human, we get it.
Yeah, but I'm biased. I've got my own unconscious bias. No, I'm not joking. Let me read you this from Cab. He said, and it's really stopped me in my tracks. He says, do you assume that if you call the police, you'll find them to be on your side and professional? Yes. Then your class privilege is such that you'll never really get what's wrong with British policing, James. Sorry, mate, I really am, but that's shining through very clearly today, and I cannot deny any of that, can I?
Can I be honest and say to you now, I don't trust police.
There you go. Why not?
And I'll tell you why I don't trust
police. You just told me that 98% of them are sound.
Well, they are. They go out and make decisions, but the problem is that it's the backing up of those decisions.
Right.
As your last caller said, the training has gone.
Yeah.
You now have to have either a degree or you have to go through what is really a pretty ropey training program. Sometimes, less than 6 weeks of desk work.
Yeah.
They're expected to make decisions on, let's be honest, some cases, domestic violence or racism cases, things like that. I've actually got a crime report on the go at the moment, not to do with me, but the police officer has not got back to me for 6 months.
Right.
I actually had to get the case reassigned because I made a complaint about it.
Yes.
and it's been reassigned. And
they're running on empty. They're running on empty, aren't they?
They are, and I'm not going to defend, the bad apples that we've all heard about in Charing Cross.
No.
Definitely they.
Hang on a minute. We believe these incidents are not isolated or simply the behaviour of a few bad apples, Steve. So they're not bad apples. They're evidence of an institutional canker.
Yeah. I investigated plenty of cases, and I knew these were bad apples. But getting the evidence to get rid of people,
and then the ranks close, and then people cover up for each other, and then pressure can be brought to bear. And if there's a culture of bullying, then you're not going to speak up or blow whistles. And of course, then we come back to the very simple observation that if you're talking about problems in the police that involve misogyny, discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment, and racism, the fact that you've got a Home Secretary who was found guilty of bullying and completely exonerated by a Prime Minister who regularly writes in a racist fashion probably helps create an atmosphere in which police officers don't sort of question their own behaviour, in much the same way that journalists don't, particularly ones that cheerlead for Boris Johnson and Priti Patel. And yes, even in the current climate, with the current cavalcade of scandals and catastrophes, there are still plenty of people in the British media cheerleading for Boris Johnson. Continuing the conversation about the Metropolitan Police for two reasons. I am still absolutely riveted by it, and three reasons, and lots of people are queuing up to contribute to it. And then thirdly, it's really important, isn't it? Not just in London, of course, but across the entire country. So we will now move on to the question of how things can be improved, I think. There's a couple of phone lines free. So, what would you do, drawing on your experiences, to make the police better? 03456060973 is the number to call. And I will get a little more detail on that suspension of the Labour MP Neil Coyle that you just heard about in the news bulletins there. I think Matthew Thompson is across that, so we'll get him to bring us up to speed with a little further detail on that. And then, well, wait and see, actually, shall we? I'd like to talk about John Major's description of Boris Johnson, because it's another amazingly worrying moment in our national decline. And of course, it's a national decline that is contingent upon having such a unsuitable Prime Minister, but the sections of the British media that continue to defend him is really worrying, because what it means is that unless you're prepared to say, I've made a terrible mistake, how on earth could I ever have supported that man, then now you have to start coming up with reasons to attack John Major for the crime of pointing out just how much Boris Johnson has debased the office of Prime Minister. Now, that's not an opinion. That's a matter of record, a matter of fact. But, there are no prizes for guessing which newspapers have elected to come out and attack John Major because Boris Johnson has debased the office of Prime Minister. And they even, and I've told you they're going to carry on doing this for the foreseeable future, but I still do a double take when I see it. They're even trying to bring Brexit back into it. Things are desperate. They're trying to bring Brexit back into it. The only reason John Major is cross that Boris Johnson has almost certainly lied in the House of Commons, the only reason John Major is cross is because of Brexit. If it wasn't for Brexit, John Major would be supremely comfortable with a Prime Minister who lies as easily as the rest of us breathe. And of course, the subtext of that is that the journalists writing these stories, and more pertinently perhaps the owners of the newspapers publishing them, are perfectly comfortable with a Prime Minister who lies as easily as he breathes, as long as that Prime Minister continues to serve the interests of the people who own the newspapers. Quite why some people a little bit further down the food chain are too stupid to realise that they are now publicly endorsing the idea that it's perfectly all right to have a Prime Minister who lies through his teeth on a daily basis, I do not know. And I do this for a living. 11:39. I guess it's just stubbornness and the inability of climbing down from a position. Well, when I suppose, because I voted for him, back in 2008, so it's great for me. I get to be on my high horse and to give lectures, because you can't accuse me of being a hypocrite. For the very simple reason that I find it very easy to climb down from that position and say, I have no idea, I must have had a fit of the vapours, a rush of blood to the head, can't believe I voted for him, fell for all the ludicrous bonhomie, was bored of Ken Livingstone, and so I voted for the bloke off the telly, the Have I Got News For You one. What an absolute idiot I was. So look, follow me, it's easy to do, all together now. Oh my days, how could I ever have voted for him? But some people find it impossibly hard to do, and it leads them into these incredibly difficult corners where they have to now pretend that there's something wrong with John Major when John Major describes Boris Johnson's debasing of the office of Prime Minister. Bit more on the police. 11:40 is the time. Phil's in Woking. Phil, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hi. So first time caller initially, so I just want to say I'm quite nervous.
It's only me.
I know. I am an ex-detective DC, used to work in a borough of London that will remain nameless. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the call you had on earlier. I caught the end of it talking about bad apples and trying to root them out. Like, that's definitely one thing, but I wanted to kind of dig into a bit of like this idea of actually what is institutional racism and how it sort of proliferates. And I remember I was in from 2008 to 2015, and I remember about 4 years in being pulled off my detective duties and shoved in I think the guys call it bully wagons, police van, and driving around a particular crime hotspot on a stop and search drive. And I remember having this realisation of that. I used to listen to the radio and used to hear people describe the police as racist and institutional, and I used to take it really personally because I worked in domestic violence, child protection. Interestingly, what was used to be referred to as the pink and fluffy.
Really?
Policing. Yeah.
Well, there it is. That's unconscious bias right there. Well, not even unconscious, mate.
I hadn't even thought about that till I speak to you now. Yeah, so that was the sort of no big boots and blue lights. It was all pink and fluffy. Anyway, but obviously through that we did a huge swathe of training. I was in, before I joined the police, I used to work in care work and work with looked after children, foster kids. Those slurs of being institutionally racist were so far from my experience of who I was. I found it quite hard, and I was sitting in this van with my silly hat on, and a stab vest, and I thought, I get it. I get what's going on here, because there was this big drive to have a visual presence on the ground to reassure the public that this particular area of South London that had a huge gang violence spike had to be addressed. So if I just explain to you how that works. So the superintendent that's in charge of the borough gets a load of money or a load of pressure, or probably both, to deal with this problem on the streets, right? So he goes, right, and it was a he at the time, he goes, right, I'm going to put a load of money, I'll get a load of boots on the ground. So then he gives that operation to some superintendent, and that superintendent then puts a plan together of how we're going to get boots on the ground and where we're going to target. And that goes out to inspectors and sergeants are instructed. And then the sergeant's the guy sitting in my van, and he says to me, right, we need, over these 2 weeks, we're aiming for 500 stops. We want to show a presence. We want to be out there. We're not sitting in our van drinking coffee. We want to reassure the public. So that's
doesn't matter who you stop then, does it?
So, but this is interesting. So it's not my borough. I don't know it.
Sure.
So I go to a briefing in a massive room full of 100 other police officers. And we get shown slide after slide after slide after slide of known gang members to target. Right? If you see these guys, this is the ones you need to stop.
Okay.
But I have to say, this particular area of London I was in, we know that poverty is linked to criminality. Sure. There's a causal across, Glasgow. The demographic of that group, that part of London, happened to be Black Afro-Caribbean. So I saw 2 white faces, and the other 88 happened to be black. And so you're going out in the van, your sergeant's saying, right, I've been told by my boss that I've got to get a number of stops. So what we're doing is stopping, I could talk to you for hours about legality of stop and searches.
Sure.
Go wisely and all these acronyms. But your sergeant says, go do that. We get out and we be as respectful and nice and kind and approachable as possible and explain what we're trying to do. They don't. There's black officers I used to work with who were stops, like every week going to work. They've never been stopped. So what happens is there's this hierarchical problem where there's a very much a do-your-job attitude. That's the managerial experience I had.
Right.
As a child protection detective, walking one day, 4 jobs on, I've got to go and speak to 4 possibly vulnerable kids. I say to my sergeant, I can't physically get to all these kids. We've only got 14 trained detectives in the entire borough. What are we going to do? He sits there and looks at me and says, do your job. So there's this militaristic, shut up and get on with it.
But it's a because I say so culture, isn't it?
If you do that rank by rank down, nobody is taking responsibility. The guy at the top or woman at the top, person at the top should be saying, what is our aim here? But they've obviously got answers. They want to turn up to their meeting and say, well, we did 500 stops and we made 72 arrests.
So that short-term box-ticking exercise creates a lifetime of animosity and community, whatever the obvious opposite of cohesion is in that community.
That's right, and this is decade after decade.
It's also bad policing, because Malcolm Gladwell writes brilliantly about this, about the lack of targeting, when really it's kind of like one street that you can come down on like a ton of bricks, rather than a whole borough or a whole postcode, and stopping everybody there means that lots of people who are completely blameless are being treated like criminals. It doesn't matter how you dice it, they are being treated like criminals. Like you said, it's never happened to me.
No, and can I just say one more thing? I mean,
of course.
If you've got hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of, I mean, you're not getting new police in, you're stealing them off.
Sure.
Domestic violence investigations, which I could, obviously, that's another conversation.
Yes.
But what you're doing is you're using the money in the wrong way. Like, what would be better? Like, you've got all this intel in South London. There's sadly, there's still a huge gang issue in all over London, but certainly in the boroughs I worked in. Huge problem. Like, you've got dedicated teams that know who these gang members are. If you're dealing with gang member violence, you're trying to target that. Why don't we do covert, undercover, long-term strategy, targeting, intelligence-based gathering, nick the guys at the... Exactly. I tell you why, it's because it doesn't get headlines. No. And because it doesn't... when you're sitting as you're...
Priti Patel can't put on a stab vest and come with you on that kind of policing exercise.
Well, it's really wobbly for Priti Patel, because actually what we're talking about is... You're putting money into, what do they say? We're going to have more frontline policing.
Yeah.
Detectives and undercover work. That's not technically frontline
policing. Final question, because I've crashed the brake. Why did you leave? Why did you knock it on the head?
I had 33 child protection investigations on my desk one morning, and the quoted amount I should have was 8, and I wasn't sleeping for 2 weeks. So
Phil, mate, you had to save yourself.
Well, we were having kids, and I'm just like, no, I can't. I was never home. So, sadly, I had other options because I've got other qualifications.
Of course.
So,
but I bet you're a brilliant copper, and they've lost you by dint of, not looking after you, not valuing you, and when you needed help, you're just told to do your job.
Do your job.
Do your job,
love
Phil.
It. Right, do your job, James. Well done,
I'm trying, Phil. I'm trying, man. Give us a break. Everyone's a critic. Look after yourself.
Nice to speak to you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Should we hop over the Atlantic now for a little look at a politician from over there, simply on the grounds that we all deserve a giggle. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is, even by the standards of the post-Trump Republican Party, is a particularly pungent politician. I think accurately described as both far right and a conspiracy theorist. Also, arguably not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Not only do we have the D.C. jail, which is the D.C. gulag, but now we have Nancy Pelosi's gazpacho police spying on members of Congress, spying on the legislative work that we do, spying on our staff, and spying on American citizens that want to come talk to their representatives.
I guess in these days of cultural appropriation, a gazpacho police may be an important idea. You could be touring the Spanish restaurants of the UK, making sure that no cold soup, chilled soup, tomato-based soup was being passed off as authentic gazpacho, while actually it was just sort of unheated Heinz or something like that. But that is just fantastic. And of course it doesn't matter, because these people have managed to get promoted, and it's not just happening in America. I wonder who the British equivalent of Marjorie Taylor Greene would be. I hesitate even to make a suggestion, but I want to listen to it one more time. So obviously, because you may have missed it, but the Gestapo is the name of the Nazi secret police, unless you're Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Not only do we have the D.C. jail, which is the D.C. gulag, but now we have Nancy Pelosi's gazpacho police spying on members of Congress, spying on the legislative work that we do, spying on our staff, and spying on American citizens that want to come talk to their representatives.
What is it in Viz? I should never cite Viz unless I'm 100% certain what it is I remember, in case the thing that I'm remembering is filthy. But it's hilarious. I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition. I got the gazpacho police. Back to the real police. Morris is in Bromley. Morris, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Long time listener. First time caller to your program.
Welcome aboard.
I've spoken the station before. I've run the station before.
Okay.
But just quickly, you spoke to a caller a few calls back, young lady by the name of Jane, former police officer.
Yes.
And your producer said to me about, the question is, how can we improve things? Well, let's touch back a bit on what she said.
Yes.
Now, my issue that I have, and people in my...
It's not a great phone line, Morris. I don't know whether you've moved a bit since you came on or something.
Hello?
That's much better. There we go. Carry on.
Now, the issue that we have with people around my circle is that you have former officers who will speak about the issues that they had when they were in the Met and what they didn't see, some of what they saw. But we in the black community have this issue where even amongst black officers, us citizens in this country, when we come across police officers in the presence of other black officers, it's no different. So when Jane says, I never really saw anything, Cressida Dick is a lovely person, so on and so on. So I don't know if it's for
She didn't say she'd never seen anything. She said the opposite of that, and she just said that her personal interactions with Cressida Dick. I don't want to argue
not
with
just Cressida Dick, but just the misogyny in there was more than the racism. I never really saw anything that bad. And I sat waiting just to say, I've seen it. I've sat down and I've been racially abused by officers, with black officers in the car.
Okay.
So for me, it's like, you know, and where's all the good apples when the bad apples are acting up?
This is the idea of saying
There's
nothing,
no whistleblowers.
being complicity.
Everyone leaves that's correct, James.
Yes.
Everyone leave the force now and say what happened. When you were there, what did you do? Did you leave because you spoke out? I saw this other, I think, Somalian heritage young man last year in the pandemic when he left and set up his own charity to help youths on the street. He left because he said they wouldn't listen to him. We've never seen officers, white, black, from any class, color, or creed, stood up and said, listen, this is taking place. I've got video footage. I've got evidence. I've got nothing. And that's the problem, because people carry on with the misogynistic attitude, with the racist attitude, the sexism, because other people sat down and just say nothing.
Well, that's what institutional means, isn't it? And
exactly. And they say nothing.
This idea that it is so embedded in the culture that to speak out against it would be to paint a target on your own back. Some people are going to have to start painting targets on their own backs, otherwise nothing is ever going to improve.
And for us in society, we would wholeheartedly respect anybody who speaks out against anything, whether it's in your family or anything. So listen, this is wrong. If your career is that you can ask us in the black community we will donate. As poor as some of us are, we will donate just to help you get back in whatever career you want to.
And that's the point, isn't it? I mean, how you blow your whistle.
Allies. We need people that will even look just to be allies, just to say, listen, I saw this, it's not right. Because when the young man complains, nobody listens. And we've got family in this country from the 50s, living here from the 50s. We've got like 5 generations of men in their 90s, 60s, 40s, 30s, and in their teens. And all of them have the same interaction with police. Now, none have been to prison before, but they'll all say to the police, nah, try to avoid them. How is that possible? 5 generations of men who've never been to prison, never been arrested for anything, but they still try to avoid the ordeal. Why?
Well, there you go. And that is, I mean, as you point out, a decades-old problem, and goodness knows where a new commissioner starts. Well, I think, actually, Morris has told us, and other callers have told us, where a new commissioner starts addressing these problems and these deep-rooted issues, and you begin by acknowledging it. That's why that IOPC report, in many ways, the most interesting phrase was that these incidents are not isolated or simply the behaviour of a few bad apples. It is, you know, riddled with rottenness, and the best way to address that is to teach people what rottenness is. And then we're back, of course, to that conundrum that I wasn't expecting to stumble across today, which is the amount of effort currently being put in this country into ridiculing and poo-pooing the very idea, A, that there is such an issue as institutional racism, a ludicrous claim that goes to Downing Street, and B, that we should work to fix it. I'm moving on only because, as I mentioned a moment ago, Alistair Morgan is waiting on the line. Alistair, as you will know, spent decades campaigning for justice for his brother Daniel, who was murdered with an axe in a pub car park in Sydenham, and suspicions pretty much from the very start that there was collusion, if you like, between members of the media and the police service. And I think you first came into contact, Alistair, with Cressida Dick in about 2012?
That's correct, James. Yeah, exactly.
And how did you find her?
Well, it was a very difficult meeting, James, because at that point, we were seeking a judicial inquiry into the police's handling of the case. And Theresa May, who was the Home Secretary at the time, said, look, I'm not making a decision until I get a report from the police about how the trial, why the recent prosecution collapsed.
Yes.
Now, we waited a whole year for the Met to produce that report, and it was presented to us in 2012 by Cressida Dick and another senior officer. And I remember we were given 30 minutes to look at it before we could question the police. And my solicitor, who was with me, said, to me, one of my assistants could have prepared this report in 3 weeks, he said, and they'd taken a year. And I then gave it, well, I was so furious with, Dick was the representative of the MPS that was standing in front of me, and I was furious. And I remember giving her a very sharp rundown on what we'd been through over, by that time, this was about 25 or 30 years we'd been dealing with the Met, and it was a very unpleasant meeting, shall we say that.
Your sense was that she wasn't interested in serving justice for Daniel, she was interested in protecting the Met, or am I misreading
no, I
you?
mean, the reading I got was stony faced, you know. It wasn't it was nothing, it was just a blank stony face. And then after that, when the panel was eventually formed, quite soon after that, it had been going for about 9 months, and quite soon after that the panel had to be reconstituted because the then chair of the panel had entered into secret communication with Cressida Dick, because she wanted, I don't know who initiated, I'm sure it must have been her that initiated it, because she wanted only him to see certain papers.
Right.
And then the rest of the panel found out about this, and then he had to go, the chair of the panel had to go, and we had to start all over again.
Grief.
And then, not content with that, right? And then we find in the report that she had been. We were going through this awful long job with the panel over years and years, and they were saying, well, we should be able to publish next spring, and then it would be, oh no, sorry about that, it's next autumn, and then, oh no, sorry about that, it's next September, and it just went on and on and on. And now we find that it was Cressida Dick had been blocking their access to the Holmes system, which they needed. It was an urgent requirement for them to do a proper job on that. And she had been blocking their access, reasonable access to the Holmes computer for years and years and years, thereby vastly increasing the costs of the inquiry, and also delaying and putting my family through another 7 or 8 years of hell. So I am pleased to see her go. Sorry to keep...
No, you've answered the question I was about to ask, Alistair, so there was no need for me to intervene. I just wondered how you greeted the news last night that she was finally to be heading off.
Yeah, well, I just thought that should have been done a long time ago when the report came out. I thought Sadiq Khan behaved disgracefully, you know, backing her up at that point.
This is the report that found the whole of the Met to be, the Met at the time, to be institutionally corrupt. It is incredible to think that somebody so closely involved in your case could end up in charge of the whole operation, and then that judgment is handed down, that report is published, and everything just carries on as normal.
Yeah, exactly. And Khan had the opportunity then, and there was a whole array, you know, the report, first of all, Priti Patel delayed the report for a month, during which time I suspect that eyes that shouldn't have seen it did see it.
Okay.
And then when the report was finally published in June last year, even before anybody could possibly have read it, I mean, it was a vast 1,250-page report. They were all out there saying it wasn't true before they could have even read it. Yes. You know, it was just a dreadful spectacle, you know.
I'll put that to Sadiq Khan next week when he's in the studio, Alistair. Ask him why he didn't act. I will, I promise you.
Yeah, give him a good grilling. Okay.
I shall do my best, Alistair.
He deserves it, yeah?
Yeah, I think on this, and I mean, and it goes back further, doesn't it? Many people thinking that her suitability for the top job should have been over when the John Charles de Menezes case unfolded, the killing unfolded. Alistair Morgan there, who's campaigned tirelessly for decades to get justice for his murdered brother Daniel, with a very not a very positive report card upon his dealings with Cressida Dick over the years.